Great. Well, thank you all for joining today and for what must have been an intense experience, but we're hoping to unpack some of that for everyone in the room. My name is Vivek. I'm in the Department of Art. I'm an MFA student. I do have a background in film, and I've been sort of interested in Professor Chadha or Avikunthak's work for some time now, and my interest sort of grew out of looking at avant-garde, sort of experimental, new wave cinema is how it was called back in India. But I know those are terms that Avikunthak has termed as problematic in describing his work. So I think I would really start by kind of asking the filmmaker if he could sort of paint a little bit of how his work fits in sort of the experimental tradition that goes by the name of cinema of Prayoga. It's a framework. It's a way of thinking about, I think, experimental filmmaking practice in India. And it's I think, one of those, I guess, formulations that are really super important, at least in my head, in sort of contextualizing your work. So I guess if you don't mind, Professor Chadha, if you could just walk us through how you arrived at film, and then how sort of you made your way into this this mode of praxis, I guess.
Thank you, Vivek. Thank you for everybody for sitting for this Q&A. I don't think of myself as an experimental filmmaker. And one of the reasons I don't think of myself as an experimental filmmaker, because in India we do not have a tradition of experimental filmmaking in the way you see in the United States or in Europe, for a very simple reason that production practices in India, to make films in India, historically has been so expensive, especially when experimental cinema was thriving both in Europe and in America in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s. Filmmaking in India was very, very expensive, mostly because not just it was production was very expensive, also because raw stock film was imported from the West. So there was heavy duties or tariffs on raw stock. So it was very difficult for filmmakers to make films which will allow them to experiment, because one of the key elements of experimental filmmaking is to make mistakes, is to experiment to see how it goes. But because cinema and raw stock was so expensive, which still it continues to be expensive, that we really do not see an historical experimental moment in India. We do see a few films emerging in the late 60s, especially in 67, 68, and 69, within the aegis of a statist organization called Films Division, a bunch of films which could be talked about or have been categorized as experimental, which were smaller works made by filmmakers who were trained in the West, who were in Bombay at that time, and they got some funding from the state and made these very small experimental films. But that was only in a small period from 1967 to 1970. In the 70s, you have the birth of what is called the new Indian cinema, or the Indian new wave of parallel cinema in India, which was a state-funded project where the state in 1969 decided that the commercial cinema, the entertainment cinema in India, the popular cinema in India was becoming too hegemonic, and to challenge that, the state decided to fund different kind of cinema. And that cinema started from 1969 to 1996. That is the period of what we call the parallel cinema, where the state was funding. State played a very important role in producing this kind of work. The majority of the films that were produced in this period were basically social realist cinematic narrative. They were radical in the sense that they broke away from the larger popular Indian cinema in different languages like Hindi or Bangla or Tamil and Telugu and Malayalam. And they were able, which was very popular. So the idea was that they played a very important role in breaking that to construct very serious social realist films. A lot of these filmmakers their films travel across the film festivals in the world, and some of them are some of the most important filmmakers in India, I would argue. Of that period, there were a bunch of filmmakers who not only broke away from the commercial filmmaking practices, but they also challenged the larger social narrative films that were being produced by the state under the aegis of the parallel cinema. And here I'm going to name two filmmakers who are deeply important to me, Mani Kaul and Kumar Shahani, who were part of the parallel cinema movement, but they even broke away from the social realist idiom and produced a different kind of cinema, which during their times, they were being called experimental, and they were aggravated by the term. They did not think of themselves experimental because they would argue exactly what I said earlier, that cinema was so expensive that there's no way you can experiment. So everything that they did was careful, was choreographed, was very carefully scripted. And their argument is that we are not doing experimental work, we are doing a kind of films which is very different, which is more philosophically driven, which is not politically driven, which is what the social realist cinema were about. They were more philosophical driven, and they were highly influenced by a filmmaker called Hrithik Ghatak, with whom they studied when Hrithik Ghatak taught at Film and Television Institute of India in the late 60s. And Hrithik Ghatak, for those of you who would not know, was a figure who was a contemporary of the great Indian filmmaker Satyajit Ray, but produced a very different kind of cinematic narrative, which one could say was more closely associated with Indian philosophical thinking rather than a social political thinking. So Mani Kaul and Kumar Shahani came from that school from 1970, 69, 70 till the 1990s, late 90s. They produced what I would argue some of the most rigorous philosophical cinemas in India. Following them, there were a few other filmmakers who also made those kind of films, but put together from 1969, 1970 till the end of 20th century, a handful of films were made. I would say less than 20 such films were made by Mani, Kumar, and a couple of other filmmakers. Mostly because these films were not, they had very difficult time even to get funding from the state, because the state was driven by a social realist narrative. They were interested in political narrative, whereas these filmmakers wanted to break away from that. My film is coming from that genealogy. As you see in this film is just not a film about political violence in India. This is also a film about the nature of violence that is there in one of the most important Hindu texts in India, the Bhagavad Gita. This is a film which is actually a commentary on Bhagavad Gita, which dovetails Bhagavad Gita and contemporary political violence in India. And the way I think of my films, following what Mani and Kumar would say, is that we are not experimental filmmakers. We do not follow within the same rubric as experimental filmmaking that happened in the West, both in America and Europe. Mostly because we are thinking philosophically, we are thinking ideologically very different from the world of Western experimental or avant-garde cinema. What I'm trying to do in my film, and this is one of my films, but because my larger body of work is to very rigorously think about Indian philosophical practices through cinematic narratives, which I started thinking about through watching films of Mani and Kumar. Where the idea was, where my thinking was that, is it possible to think and articulate philosophically through cinematic narratives? And the term that has now been given is the term that I take refuge in, is a term called cinema of Prayoga. The term cinema of Prayoga was used for the first time in 2006, 2007 by a film critic called Amrit Gangar, who argued exactly the way I'm arguing now, is that the term experimental and avant-garde are too Western in their philosophical provenance, and therefore they do not do justice to the kind of political, philosophical, ideological ideas that we are summoning in these cinematic texts. And so the term experimental doesn't work at all. The term cinema of Prayoga is a more appropriate term. The word Prayoga is a combination of the word yoga, which I'm sure most of you know, and pra, which is a suffix. So Prayoga would mean something like a way of thinking which is different. That would be a very general way of thinking about what Prayoga means. And I think I want to believe that that is a term much more appropriate for the kind of work I am doing than the term experimental.
Yeah. That definitely, I think, helps, at least for me as also a filmmaker that grapples with this idea of an idiom that is not bound by avant-garde or other formulations. I'm really inspired and really sort of motivated by this formulation that Professor Chadha just sort of enunciated. Another thing I think that I find really interesting about his body of work is also, I guess it has its roots in your background, which is you were trained in archaeology, and you later did doctoral work in cultural anthropology. You also have a background in political activism. So I know you mentioned the Indian New Wave, and specifically the filmmakers that you mentioned, Mani Kaul and Kumar Shahani. They took a very different route from the political, I guess, cinema that was sort of state sponsored in a way. How, in your eyes, does that training sort of inform your practice, or how has it thus far?
I started making films in the mid-90s, exactly around the time when I started doing my master's in archaeology. For me, cinema becomes a very fertile ground to think, as I said, philosophically, but more interestingly or more importantly, when I think of myself as an archaeologist and later as a cultural anthropologist, I think some of the key questions that has intrigued me, and they still kind of I struggle with, is our civilizational questions for India and South Asia in general. And the fact that I'm an archaeologist is that it helps me in the sense that the kind of depth I can go into thinking about the civilizational question, as you can see in this film, Bhagavad Gita is a text written probably around the beginning of the first millennium. And I'm trying to think about, like, in this film, this is a civilizational film than just a merely political film, where I'm thinking about a text like Bhagavad Gita. So what you see in this film is, so Bhagavad Gita is the philosophical core of the larger monumental epic called the Mahabharata. And this is the moment in this massive epic where there is an 18-day war between two groups of cousins, and Arjun, who's one group, is talking to Krishna, who's a godhead, and asking him that, how can I kill my own kinsman? And that's an existential and a political and a philosophical and a theological question for him. That how do I, or why should I kill my own kinsman? And he says in the middle of the war that I cannot, and you have to help me, Krishna. And that's how Bhagavad Gita begins, which is an 18 chapter, close to about close to about 1,500 to 1,800 verses. And this film only is a commentary on 36 verses. From the second verse of chapter 2 to verse number 38 of chapter 2. In this chapter, this is considered to be one of the core verses in the 1,500, 1,800 odd verses, where Krishna says that it is okay to kill because human body consists, the key or the core of human body is the soul, and the soul is unmutable, so it is okay to kill. So this is one of the most astonishing philosophical justification of violence in India. And what I try to do in this film is to think about this particular justification of violence, which is nearly 2,000 years old, to think about the nature of violence in contemporary India. So what I'm trying to do in this film is that this is just not merely a political film, but it is a civilizational film. I'm kind of thinking about, in this film, through this film, thinking about what it means to be violent in contemporary India. And what I also do in this film, so that is one track, and then you have the track of the police person who's the encounter specialist, and then you have these rituals that you see in the film where you see animal sacrifice and you see bodily harm of the human. And I try to think about all these three elements in the film. So I think what I'm trying to do, what archaeology and cultural anthropology does is that it helps me to think about contemporary political moment within a deep philosophical and almost a civilizational praxis, which is what I'm really interested in.
It's interesting you bring up the ritual aspect. There's a lot of that in the film. There's all these scenes of self-mortification, there's animal sacrifice, and how that's sort of part of this religiosity in India. But I'm wondering if, because Prayoga is also sort of translated sometimes as ritual, as practice, so it's almost like as if your mode of filmmaking is a sort of ritualistic sort of coming to terms with this, in my head, these two sort of vectors that have been forever kind of determining Indian spiritual life and thought, which is one, I think the way the film speaks to me are the female characters, which sort of, for me, embody this goddess cult, or as we call it, Shakti in India. So there's that, which is sometimes by some scholars thought of as being more indigenous in some ways and more rooted in sort of the Indian subcontinent. And then there's the other tangent, or the other vector, which is this Vedantic sort of tradition, where, as you said, there seems to be this astonishing sort of justification for violence. And you see that in the characters when as they sort of are trying to collectively process this this discrepancy almost. How does your film? How much is your filmmaking and your mode of this Prayoga sort of trying to grapple with this issue? Because I feel like a lot of the Indian, like you said, the political situation is sort of just a representation or the manifestation of this unresolved fault line in Indian sort of intellectual or thought tradition. And to me, it's interesting as as a cultural anthropologist, person that's trying to work with a different mode of filmmaking, that almost becomes your way of addressing this outside of normal modes of filmmaking or artistic practice. So I'm just curious how that, in your head, how you kind of view your practice as doing some of that reconciling?
I think of cinema as a ritual practice. Like just the very act of cinema is a ritualistic act, although this is technological ritualism in a certain sense. So for me, cinema is not far away from a certain ritual way of being that is commonly found in India. So for me, both of them kind of, I mean, I do not see them as a rupture of any science. It's for me, it's kind of the same world. And that's why I got into cinema, because I found cinema to be a very deeply ritual practice. And what I try to do in cinema, in the kind of work I'm doing, is that I'm trying to infuse the religious ritual practice within the cinematic ritual practice. And that is how I try to deal with it in my body of work. My body of work doesn't produce answers. They're a way of thinking through processes. Like this film, I'm not trying to answer anything in this film. It doesn't have an answer or an end. It just, for me, cinema is a process of thinking through, which I think when I'm trying to write as a scholar, it requires a certain kind of conclusion. But I think in cinema, I can be more open-ended. I find filmmaking a much more liberatory process than, let's say, doing scholarly work about the same topics that I'm trying to deal with.
So it's almost like it's another type of epistemic sort of activity, intervention that you're making that's probably not possible in the discursive.
I think so, yeah. I think the scholarly discursive space I find highly constricted, but I think within the cinematic practice, especially in this mode of cinema, not in any other modes, is that it opens up a lot of possibilities, which I think is the crux of the Prayoga project.
Well, Pratyush, you've shot, I believe, 4 of Ashish's films thus far, maybe more to come. What for you has been the most, I guess, challenging, but also sort of rewarding aspect of working within this framework, within this sort of mode of filmmaking, which I'm sure, you found sort of different from other directors you've worked with, because I'm in your experiences working on other film projects that may be independent in their sort of in their making, but they still follow sort of other more traditional ways of production. So just wondering how that's been different for you working with a director like Ashish.
Yeah, this goes all the way back to film school actually, because we watched Fritz Geraldo, Werner Herzog, he was here once. They used to talk about, don't do what Herzog does. People die on their sets. There's no safety net. Like, you can get washed away in the river. Something might fall on your hand. You may lose your hand. Well, the cinematographer famously lost their hand. While it's not that risky on his projects, it's there. So there's no safety net. I remember being chased by the cops in this film because we didn't have the permission. Do you remember the shot where she's sort of floating those little,
on the river, yeah.
Yeah, on the river. Right next to it, the banks, we were supposed to do like a dialogue sequence. Actually, it's there in the film. And then I see 2 sinister-looking gentlemen on the stairs, and I was like, all right, we may need to stop. And he goes, no, keep shooting, I'll talk to them. I was like, all right, okay. I went over there. It's the police. I was like, okay, run with the camera, go. they want the, yeah, so I was like, okay, I know what to do, pack up, let's keep moving, all right, with the data. I was like, so we walked all the way down, well, how many miles were that? From there to Dashashwan. It was like all the way at the end of the, and then he kind of had to pay them a bit of money to get the whole thing sorted out and stuff like that. But that's how it happened again when we were shooting in Calcutta, and it was just randomly, they just pulled us over. I was like, what are you guys doing? Well, making TikTok. What, in the middle of the night? Can't complain, you know, that's just the way it is these days. We're like, all right. So without making any fuss, we just packed up and left. So that's one of the things. And, you know, the ritualistic sacrifices, I've never shot anything. I've worked on documentaries, like, ever since I graduated, really. And it was between that or work on TV commercials and music videos, which I did for a little bit, but it wasn't really challenging or, you know, that kind of stuff. And one of the things, the reason why I went back all the way, you know, to my film school days is like, there's a way of teaching films in film schools, and it's like, safety first, do this, and you always relay back to, I'm not saying to any wonderful 101 students watching here, you know, to don't do that, but also there's another way of making films, or many other ways of making films, where you don't have the luxury of doing that, but like you said, the ritual itself is so compelling, and that's probably the only way of doing that. I wouldn't know of any ways of shooting Chorok or like any of the Bali sequences, the sacrificial sequences, you know, without the risk of facing the blood or the head falling down and stuff like that. So you can't really experience that, you know, if you follow those sort of safety guidelines in film school. So that's like a big eye-opener. Like I was telling you in the green room, there's a difference between someone who's trained in a film school with an MFA degree in cinematography and someone who is not trained as a filmmaker, who has a PhD in anthropology, cultural anthropology from Stanford, making films. There's a huge difference between their approach. They can make this exactly the same film, but the approach will be so different. The approach to the practice, the ritual of making the film will be so different. And so I think the biggest training was unlearning that ritual that film school teaches you and relearning a new one. That would be my answer.
Interesting. Just shifting gears a little bit, another thing I noticed, so there's the production on this film seems to have been sort of in various different places, of course, but there's a lot of indoor scenes, which, you know, could be anywhere, but I'm assuming it's in Kolkata. And then there's other outdoor scenes in different parts. There's Benares for sure. What's production like on, you know, a film like this? What size is the crew? Is there, you know, is there sort of a plan to the way you kind of go about your day, or is it more spontaneous? Are you know, reacting to situations? In terms of scripting, you know, how does something that we see on screen sort of, how do you arrive at that? Is it planned down to you know, to the exact pan that you're looking for, or is it also a sort of an extension of this idea of Prayoga, where you have a sense where, you know, of where you're going directionally, but you may not entirely have figured out what you're doing until you get to the spot. So I'm just curious what that production process is like on a film like this.
Right. You see, Prayoga, it's such a capacious word, and it also changes its meanings when it gets translated from Sanskrit into Bengali and other languages as well. In Bengali, the closest approximation would be application. And in that sense, I think some people might confuse Prayoga filmmaking with experimental. Oh, yeah, it's the same thing. No, it's not. But the reason why I say that is because he doesn't write scripts. Never. only dialogues, written dialogues. It looks like a text, like you're reading from an actual book. And he's published his so-called screenplays like that, which looks exactly like a text. I kid you not. Screenplays are supposed to have screen directions, screen instructions. None of those. So you go to a place, you have an idea of what the scene may or may not look like, and the rest is contingent on whether you're going to get chased by a policeman or get mauled by a tiger, really. So it's, you kind of react to it. But having said that, there is a kind of, there's a phase where you prepare. And much of that happens just prior to the shoot, in which there's a dialogue. Okay, where are you going to stand? Oh, do you think the sun's going to be that way? So we're going to have to calculate the exposure a little bit. And it's mostly technical, but within that technical conversation, I'm trying to sense a kind of energy within him of what he wants, approximately what he wants. It's never exact. So I would say like my documentary training, came to good use, I would say, because there's a tradition of documentary which in the West is known as the newsreel documentary, which emerged from the war, war photography and stuff like that. And that kind of is the predominant. I was trained in London, which, BBC, newsreel, that's all they understand. I mean, there are other ways of doing it, doing documentaries in the UK, but the most prominent way is the UK way of doing it, which is exactly what it is. You go to a place, you react to it, and it comes from a colonial practice. You go to a place, you document, you look at new culture, and you go, oh, what's that? And slowly but surely, you get trained to react in a certain way, that you won't go, oh. You would want to be curious about what's going on without, showing your curiosity. So yeah, it kind of is contingent upon the situation most of the times.
The way I usually work as I said, I don't write script. The only thing I write are dialogues. And for a film like this, I would write dialogues in English, and I work with a collaborator who is a literary person, so he would write in this very highly literary form of Bangla, which is what you're hearing. So this is also, for those of you, I suspect there are very few Bengali speakers here, but for those who would hear this kind of Bengali, this is also very different. This is not the kind of language that would be spoken on a daily.
It's not like conversation.
This is not conversational language at all. This is highly embellished language. So that is something, a conscious choice. Again, a way of breaking away from the normative. So what I work with, so for example, a film like this, I really didn't know what the film would be. I only knew that I was making film. I had two ideas. One was Bhagavad Gita, that I was very interested in Bhagavad Gita. The other was this narrative about a conversation. What could be a conversation between an encounter specialist and his wife or lover? And I had these two ideas in mind. So what we did, we started the film by shooting the conversation bit first over the course of. So this film I shot for about 2 years. The edit took another year and so on and so forth. But it was shot for about 2 years. The first part of the film that we did was just shoot the relationship between the lover, the person and the two women. As I said, I did not know where the film was going. And then I shot the Bhagavad Gita part of it a little later. The sequence of violence, the animal sacrifice, the body mortification, I was shooting simultaneously. This is a long project I've been doing for the last 10 years, is to shoot these kind of ritualistic activity, and I have a big archive that I've been shooting for many years. And it was happening simultaneously. So it's only when I start editing it that I started playing around so the film, the narrative that you see was made on the edit table, which took about 6 months to edit, trying to figure out how the film will go. And what you see, this 86-minute, is basically a film made on the edit table. That's the usual way I work. I really don't enjoy making films with the script. One of the things that I want to kind of emphasize here is that there is, and this is one of the way of thinking about this, is also this film is a response, a critical response to a genre in Hindi cinema that emerged in the 90s, which were basically the encounter specialist cinema, where you would have these police officers who would do extrajudicial killing, and they would be highly celebrated in the cinematic narratives. Extrajudicial killing in India, it has a long history, goes back to as early as the late 60s to early 70s, when in Bengal, where I come from, in Calcutta, the city I come from, in 1969, when there was the rise of the extreme left movement, the revolutionary left or the Maoist left, or the term that is colloquially used in India, the Naxalite movement. So the Indian state, one of the ways the Indian state used was the strategy of extrajudicial killing, and thousands of people were killed in Bengal in the late 60s and early 70s. And that strategy of committing extrajudicial killing has happened throughout the Indian history, from Indian contemporary post-colonial history since the 1970s. So something that I was very aware of. And in Indian cinema, especially in Bollywood cinema in the 90s, there was a string of films made which celebrated this kind of extrajudicial killing. And so this film is also a response to that kind of what is called the encounter specialist films, where I'm trying to critique that celebratory form of narrative that emerged with filmmakers like Ram Gopal Varma, Anurag Kashyap, and others who celebrated this kind of extrajudicial killing. So this film is also a response to that. This was just a footnote to what I was trying to say, but to get back to the production practice is that, as Pratyush mentioned, I work with a very, very minimal crew, almost as Pratyush, it's almost a documentary crew. I am there, Pratyush as the DOP is there, there's a sound person with a boom, we have labeled the way we have been labeled right now. We label the actors and 2 or 3 actors. And then what we do is that if we're shooting in an interior space where a part of this film is there, it is a much more controlled space. So we would do a very minimal lighting. But when you shoot in a place like Banaras or Calcutta, where we have shot, as Pratyush said, we would just go there and just see what kind of location we have, and then just see how the space responds, not just to me, but also to Pratyush, but also to the actors. And then we try improvising. So some of these scenes, for example, some of the scenes that I would shoot a lot of time, probably 15 takes, and then when we're editing it, then we'll figure out. And therefore, what you see in some of these scenes, there's a lot of jump in location, is because we're jumping from space to space. And that's the style then that I have worked with. I'm dislocating, so there's a spatial dislocation, and if you know Bengali, there is a linguistic dislocation, along with other dislocations that you see in the film. And this is a very conscious attempt at creating this form.
And I'm imagining the digital imaging or the digital image acquisition workflows have been entirely beneficial in this way of working. So I know, for instance, the earlier part of your body of work was entirely celluloid, but you're one of those filmmakers that seems to have sort of made that transition into digital, not just making that transition, smooth, but also entirely a part of this way of working. So can you talk a little bit about, how has that changed your process, one, but how has that sort of been liberatory in the way of sort of, working in this largely sort of directionally oriented, but very spontaneous and contingent style of working, which I would imagine is very hard to do or even forbidden in sort of the celluloid workflow.
It's not forbidden. I think you can be equally mobile if you're working on especially a medium like 16 millimeter, where you can be very mobile, especially if you're working on handheld camera. The most important shift has been financial. To make a film on celluloid is monumentally expensive. It was always the case. It still continues to be the case. To work on digital is very liberatory because I can shoot a lot more than, for example, when I would shoot on celluloid, my shooting ratio would not be more than 1:3. I could not afford anything more than that. But when I'm shooting on digital, my shooting ratio has now moved from 1:3, sometimes 1:15, 1:12. So I can shoot a lot more. Also, the digital is more mobile. I mean, the 16 millimeter camera, especially if you're shooting on Pollock or on an Aries, a small handheld Aries, it's very mobile. But I think with digital camera, which is way more mobile, which has been very, very useful. And the other thing, but I think that although the transition from celluloid to digital have happened, I'm still very wedded to the cinematic image. Yeah. And so what you see in this film, although this was shot digitally, during the color correction, both I and Pratyush and Ritujit, who's the color corrector of the film, and Bashov, who's the other DOP of the film, all four of us spent a lot of time working on the color correction of the film to create, to work, to transform the starkness of digital to the graininess of the celluloid. So we worked very hard on trying to do that. We worked on two separate color corrections. First, we worked on Baselight, which is a very sophisticated color correction system. Then we moved to DaVinci. Then again, we moved to Baselight, and then again, we moved back to DaVinci. So we did a lot of juggling back and forth to get this kind of a cinematic texture, which is very, very important to both of us. And that is, so although I have given up, I wouldn't say given up, although celluloid is too expensive, but the cinematic texture of the celluloid, I'm still nostalgic about.
Yeah. The graininess that you see, the misconception is that digital has grain, just like film. No, it doesn't. What you see in digital is noise. It's basically when you amplify a signal, electronic signal, beyond its own sort of range, its own range of tolerance, you start seeing noise. What that does is that creates, noise in different channels. So RGB, you'll see all kinds of little dots with all colors and stuff, which is not what film grain is. Film grain is unwashed silver from the silver halide through the processing itself. We had to denoise the whole thing. I don't know if you remember that. Get rid of the electronic noise, add grain separately. So all the grain that you see are samples from film grains, 16 and 35, that were then sort of artificially added, like an added layer. And so I don't know if I've spoken to you about this, but it's like the texture of the cloth, that the whole film looks like a cloth with a certain texture to it. And that's what the added grain is. I was watching it today and it just came out really nice. So that was intentional, actually.
And another thing that really moved me in the cinematography of it, as stark as the subject matter is, I think there at least for me, as I was watching it today, these images of sort of almost poetic beauty of, either ripples in the water, especially as the person sort of, sitting by that pond, that, doing sort of what looked like a ritual, for an ancestor or a loved one that's departed. Small moments like those, as well as this sort of kaleidoscopic work with either filters or something that's really very, in terms of image, trying to bring this quality almost of a refractive vision. I'm curious if that's, how that plays with sort of the visual design of the film and the way that you were thinking of this sort of film as a refractive exercise of, can you look beyond what you're seeing, what the image is in front of your eyes, almost to sort of reach beyond that in a certain way. So just if you could talk a little bit about the visual design of this, if there was such a thing that you were kind of playing with in mind.
Yeah, it kind of, when you find like a piece of coin, like when you're walking down Ivy and there's a coin, pick it up, and that becomes your visual design, because you kind of stumble upon it instead of consciously thinking about it, which is very contingent, like I said. But one of the things that he introduced me to, and this is, again, the film school training comes back. We did a Steadicam workshop, which is like a huge old contraption. You used to be trained in it and stuff like that. And then he showed me, well, you don't need a Steadicam. You can do it with a gimbal. I was like, all right, let's try it. And the thing that happened on the first day, he just drove us into a busy sort of marketplace in a bazaar, and I was like, there's nice people here and stuff like that. Opens the door, he goes, go out, shoot. And then, basically shooting in the market and stuff. He said, don't walk forward, let the actor walk towards you, walk backwards. So you'll see a lot of tracking back shots. And movement backwards became like a sort of, motif in the film. Yeah, it's like you would see that, because there are places where you can't really lay tracks, and that would be like a huge thing, because you'd need another car for there would be a production hassle. So how do you go about that? So you kind of use the gimbal as a dolly, or like a Steadicam, but without the sort of wobbliness of a Steadicam. So the idea is to keep it straight so that it looks like a dolly shot. The Janet Walker, who was a professor in this department, film and media studies department, wrote, there was like an edited volume by her, and there was a chapter in it, and I was reading it after making that film. Rich Farrell was here, again, he recommended that chapter to me. It was on the use of Steadicam, really. And the argument is that the Steadicam allows you to go anywhere and everywhere without having to worry about how do you go through spaces. It will join. They were reading, I don't know if you've seen, I think it was one of the Rocky films, when the Philly staircases, he walks up and down and stuff, and famous Garrett Brown's work. And it's the joining of different spaces without having to go through that production hassle and stuff. And that movement became like a motive. Wherever we go, I'm looking for movement, so either in the background or off the camera. Right. So that became part of the design. The rest kind of fell into place contingently. Yeah.
The other thing I really enjoyed, and I'm assuming people sort of caught on to this, which is the sound sort of universe of this film. Which to me is, it's rife with sort of this. Of course, there's there's the chanting, and there's all of the ritual sort of soundscape that you sort of create for this film. It to me, it sort of summons this whole like orality in Indian sort of culture, where there's an oral culture that goes back millennia, which in some ways, is more crucial or central to sort of Indian storytelling than the visual imagination. So I'm wondering what that was like for you guys as you were thinking of putting together the sound for this film, because I know I've heard from you before that you don't like using location sound.
No, I think when I meant by that, so the sound design was very complex. First of all, what I meant is that we do not use dialogues on location, so we don't use sync sound, because sync sound is virtually impossible to be used, because there's so much of ambience noise. Even like in the indoor shots, we were shooting in an apartment in Calcutta. We were shooting in the middle of the night. We would start our shoot at about 12 o'clock at night, continue till about 4 in the morning because it would be quiet. But it would not be quiet because there'll be cars moving out, there'll be noise, and we could not use sync sound. So I do not use sync sound in my film, mostly because it is impossible to use in the first place. Second, I don't like using sync sound. I prefer dubbed sound or post-synchronized sound, because in post-synchronized sound gives me another layer of control where when the actors come, I can work with them to get the right modulation, which probably when they were shooting it was missing or we could not hear. So it gives me another layer of control and direction.
Right.
So I prefer, almost all my film over the last 30 years have had post-synchronized sound work. That's for dialogues. The sound design work, I've been working with my sound designer collaborator, Shukanta Mojumdar, for nearly 15 years. And over the years, we have developed a very strong intuitive ways of thinking about sound. So a lot of the sound design was constructed. We were going back and forth. What kind of ambience to use, what kind of music to use, what kind of backgrounds. There's not really a background score, but it's like a sound design work, which complements the grimness of the film. And that was something we worked, again, for about 6 months, back and forth to do this work.
Interesting. I think another thing that I wanted to sort of touch upon was this idea of, and I think you probably touched on this in your answers earlier, but the female characters seem to be entirely, in sort of a mentally, harmonious sort of relationship where they're never seen speaking to each other almost in any scene that they appear in. Whereas all of the interactions between sort of the male protagonist and the female, it seems to be always sort of this confrontational. There's the idea of a sort of dialectical back and forth, and it's always unresolved. I'm wondering if that's sort of a comment on this idea that you touched on, which is your frustration with the discursive sort of mode of trying to get to the bottom of what seems like an irreconcilable sort of fault line. And if you, as the filmmaker, as a person that studies Indian thought, sort of place your trust in sort of this, the wisdom of the femininity in Indian sort of philosophical tradition, versus this sort of almost hysterical, male effort to try to come to terms with this, philosophical, which to me it's really unresolved. I mean, because it really is asking you, it is legitimizing violence as a way of kind of reaching, place of liberation, which leads to all sorts of, I think it comes out really in an absurd comical way in some of the dialogue that the protagonist sort of mouths, which is entirely absurdist in its, the way that he reaches his conclusions. So I'm wondering if that's, again, sort of your cultural anthropology, the anthropologist in you that's kind of placing your bets on where Indian civilization needs to sort of pivot to.
I will not. That's a difficult question to answer, because I really don't have an answer to that about the possibility of the future, because the future never arrives, right? So I really don't know. However, I think there are answers in the past, especially within the Indian philosophical tradition, and my own particular religious faith lies in the Shakta practice, which is the mother goddess tradition. So probably in a certain sense, this film is a critique not just on violence, but is also a critique of patriarchy. And the women figures are, in a certain sense, are emerging from a Shakta framework. I don't want to talk more about it because then it'll become too analytical. I would rather let the audience grapple with the possibility of the future.
Yeah, no, and to me, as a person that's interested in, again, another sort of thread, I think, in your academic work is this idea of sort of decolonizing and like decolonial perspectives, which in most cases, again, leads to moving away from this sort of hegemony of, dominant views, which in most cases, again, has been sort of a patriarchal or a certain way of looking at problems, which, again, to your point, tends to be analytical, and that is privileged in some ways, than the feminine sort of understanding that you see, displayed by the characters on screen. But I think for me, it also becomes a place where the anthropologist is really informing the filmmaker by sort of holding back from doing what conventional filmmakers would do. And so I think that was really, for me, a way that your training and your academic work in decolonial perspectives kind of really comes through just by in your way of constructing the sound image sort of collage. So I really sort of latched onto it. So I just thought I would bring that up. I'd like to open it up now, I think, for questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for this. It left me with a lot to think about and probably a million questions to ask. But what I was really interested in is the inclusion of the CIA interrogation manual. And I'd love to hear a bit more about that decision.
I'm so glad you asked the CIA question. So this particular manual, which is the Kubrak manual, was a secret manual that was used by CIA, especially during their time in Latin America throughout the 60s and the 70s. And it was during my research, not so much a research, when I was doing some reading about the killings in India, I found out, I was told by someone, and I really don't have, I can't give you the evidence or a footnote where I found it, but I was told that this particular manual was also circulating in the intelligence community in India. And so when I started thinking, the Kubrak manual was added almost at the end of the shoot, and I thought that I have to use that, mostly because of its possibility of it being used in India, and also a certain possibility of the nature of global violence that we see. So that's like the Kubrak manual is actually the footnote in the film. If you can think about that, it's a footnote. It's not. It's there. It's like the side narrative of violence, which I really would like to work on more, especially the present situation in this country.
Hi. So I had a question about. So you mentioned that this was also a response of like the films in the 90s and so on, which really made these encounter killings a heroic form and so on. And I feel like the society then encapsulates that idea and then reacts in that form, and then also thinks in a similar way. Have you felt that, like, so on the contrary view that you have, the contrary point of view that you have shown will also have some sort of reaction from there? Have you experienced any changes or like?
You're talking about this film form.
Yeah.
See, the problem about this film form is that this film will never be shown in India. So it will not. the kind of films I make, and generally not just this film, my larger body of work, they have difficulties to be shown in India, mostly because I do not get, in my initial career, when I started making film, I would go to the censor board to get censor certificate. India, as you know, has a very strong censorship regime. So my early films, I tried and I was denied censor a couple of times. And so for the last 20 years, not 20, 15 years, I've not been to censor board because I know they will not give me. So, and this is the case with this film. I don't think so will be shown in India in a public capacity. And therefore, in order for it to have any impact, it needs to have a similar circulation as Bollywood film, which I don't think so is possible. So I don't think so any change will happen.
Well, great. Again, thank you, Professor Chadha, for graciously accepting our invitation and coming over to share your work. Thank you, Carsey-Wolf Center and the Film and Media Studies Department for promoting and encouraging this sort of work. I think it is the case that we all stand to benefit from watching more perspectives on filmmaking, more ways of seeing and enjoying films. So I'm really thankful to everyone that made it possible. And we hope you enjoyed the presentation. We hope to see you all back in another time with another film. So thank you.
Thank you.